Someone at a family dinner asks the question, they always do. It arrives between the main course and dessert wearing the costume of casual concern. So are you seeing anyone? Don't you think it's time? And across the table, a 40-something with a full life, a paid-off car, a houseplant they have kept alive for 6 years, and a very clear sense of what they want and don't want just smiles. Not the smile of someone who hasn't thought about this. The smile of someone who has thought about it more carefully than the person asking ever will. They change the subject, they pour more wine. They ask about someone else's kids with genuine interest, and the moment passes and they drive home alone through quiet streets to a house that is arranged exactly the way they want it. And somewhere between the car and the front door, they feel something that is not loneliness and not quite contentment, but something occupying the space between the two, something they have stopped trying to explain to people who haven't felt it. This video is not about people who couldn't find the right person. It is not about people who gave up. It is not a consolation prize dressed up as psychology. It is about a generation that watched a specific institution perform a very public series of failures during their most impressionable years and made, in many cases, a quiet and considered and entirely rational decision about what that meant for them. Today, we are going to look honestly at the psychology behind that decision. And some of what we find may surprise you, including perhaps what it reveals about yourself. To understand this, you have to go back to the 1970s, not to statistics, to kitchens, to the specific sound of two adults who are no longer speaking to each other, having dinner in the same room, to the way a child learns to read the emotional weather of a house, the way a sailor reads the sky, not because anyone taught them to, but because it became necessary. Because the alternative was being caught off guard by weather you could have seen coming, divorce rates in the United States and much of the Western world climbed steadily through the late 1960s and peaked dramatically in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This is not a political observation, it is a demographic one. An enormous number of children who would become Generation X watched their parents' marriages end, sometimes loudly, sometimes in the long, quiet agony of two people staying together in a house that had stopped being a home. And the ones whose parents stayed together, many of them watched something perhaps more instructive. The performance of a marriage that had hollowed out, the careful maintenance of an institution that was serving no one inside it, adults who had made a promise in their 20s and were keeping it in their 40s with an expression that told the children everything the adults were not saying. What does a child do with that information? They file it the way children file everything that matters and can't be asked about directly. They file it in a part of the mind that doesn't have a label but has enormous influence. The part that will, 20 years later, stand in a jeweler's looking at rings and feel something that isn't quite fear and isn't quite certainty, but is something that needs to be listened to. The children of this era grew up in houses where love and marriage were not synonymous, where commitment and happiness were not reliably the same thing, where the institution that was supposed to organize adult life had demonstrated with statistical regularity that it was not as stable as advertised. This was not a lesson anyone taught them. It was a lesson the environment delivered, the way environments always deliver the most important lessons through accumulated experience rather than direct instruction. The emotional programming that resulted from this formation is worth examining carefully because it is easy to misread from the outside. What developed in many children of this era was not a fear of love. They are, as a group, capable of deep and genuine attachment. The friendships that survive from this generation span decades and distances and silences that would dissolve lesser relationships. They know how to love. That is not the issue. What developed was something more specific, a finely calibrated skepticism about the institutional container that love is supposed to go into. A distinction arrived at not through cynicism, but through observation between the feeling and the form. Between what two people actually are to each other and what a legal document and a party and a set of social expectations say they should be. Gabor Mate, in his work on how early experience shapes the nervous system, describes how children who grow up in unpredictable emotional environments develop a heightened sensitivity to relational threat, a kind of early warning system that becomes so well calibrated it can detect danger in situations that others would walk into without hesitation. This is not a pathology, it is an adaptation. The nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are designed to do, learning from its environment and adjusting accordingly. For this generation, The environment taught a very specific lesson about what happens when you build your entire life around a single relationship that you are legally and socially obligated to maintain, regardless of whether it continues to serve either person inside it. They watched the lesson run its course across the childhoods of millions of their peers, and they took notes. What this produced is not the inability to commit, it is something more sophisticated than that. It is the ability to distinguish between commitment as a feeling and commitment as a form, and to choose the feeling without necessarily choosing the form. The defining traits of this group are worth naming because they are consistently misread. The first is self-sufficiency, and not the aspirational self-sufficiency of someone who has chosen independence as a lifestyle brand. The practiced bone-level self-sufficiency of someone who learned early that depending on a single person or a single institution for your entire emotional and material well-being was a structural vulnerability that the evidence did not support. What looks from the outside like an inability to need people is almost always, from the inside, a very deliberate management of how much you need any one person. Not because love isn't real, because the cost of its withdrawal, when your entire architecture is built around a single load-bearing wall, is something this generation watched enough times to understand viscerally. The second is a particular relationship to autonomy that goes deeper than preference. For people who grew up in houses where the adult's unhappiness was a weather system that everyone inside the house lived in, the ability to control your own environment, to arrange your life according to your own rhythms, to make decisions without committee, to come and go without negotiation, is not a luxury. It is a form of psychological safety that was unavailable during the years when psychological safety was being formed. The third is what we might call relational pragmatism, the capacity, sometimes admired, sometimes mistaken, for coldness to assess a relationship on its actual merits rather than on what it is supposed to mean. To ask not, is this the right form, but does this actually work for both people involved? To have, because they watch the alternative so clearly, a very low tolerance for relationships that are being maintained by obligation rather than by genuine mutual sustenance. The armor this generation built around intimacy is worth examining with some care because it is more complex than it appears. There is, in many cases, a particular humor about it, the jokes about being fine alone, the dry self-awareness about their own patterns, the way they can describe their own commitment avoidance with an accuracy and a lightness that suggests they have done considerable work understanding it, even if they haven't done the work of changing it. This is the irony that functions as distance, and this generation perfected it. There is also a particular form of emotional minimalism, the tendency to keep the inner life interior, to be deeply feeling and almost entirely unexpressive in the ways that culturally legible intimacy requires you to be expressive. To show love through action, through the quietly replaced grocery item, through the repair made without being asked, through the presence that doesn't announce itself rather than through declaration. This armor was built for very specific reasons. It was built by children who watched declaration fail, who watched the big promises made in front of witnesses dissolve into litigation and separate apartments, and the particular grief of watching your parents become people who cannot be in the same room, who learned that the formal performance of commitment was not a guarantee of its content. The armor is a rational response to a specific set of observed conditions. Understanding that doesn't make it less costly, but it makes it less mysterious. And here is what needs to be named, because it rarely is. Many people in this generation who avoid marriage are not avoiding love. They are protecting love. They are keeping it out of an institutional container that they watched, up close, crush it. That distinction matters enormously, and it is almost never made by the people asking the questions at family dinners. The cognitive gifts that this formation produced are real and significant and consistently underestimated. The capacity for honest self-knowledge about relational patterns, for knowing exactly what you do and why you do it, even when you continue to do it, is something that many people never develop. This generation, having been forced to examine the institution of marriage from the inside during its most impressionable years, developed an analytical relationship to intimate partnership that is genuinely sophisticated. They are, in many cases, excellent partners when they choose to partner, precisely because they do not take the relationship for granted the way people sometimes take things they have institutionally secured. Because they have to keep choosing it, because the choice is never finished. Because there is no paperwork making it easier to stay than to leave, which means that staying is always a current and active decision, which means that when they stay, they are staying. There is a body of research, not always cited in the conversations about marriage avoidance, suggesting that long-term unmarried partnerships that are actively chosen and maintained tend to have different qualities than marriages that are maintained partly by inertia and institutional obligation. Not better, necessarily, different. The act of choosing changes something about how the relationship is held. This generation figured this out not from research, but from watching. From the evidence of their own childhoods, from the long, quiet, available for inspection laboratory of their parents' lives. In professional environments, this psychology expresses itself in ways that are now familiar enough to have become cliches, but that have real roots worth tracing. The resistance to institutional loyalty, the preference for project-based engagement over lifetime employment, which is to say, the preference for relationships with institutions that are maintained by current mutual benefit rather than by long-term obligation. The deep discomfort with being asked to give more than the relationship has earned. This is the same psychology that shapes their approach to marriage, applied to a different domain. The same fundamental question, is this institution actually serving the people inside it, or are the people inside it serving the institution? When the answer to that question starts to feel like the second option, this generation exits. Not always loudly, often with the same quiet pragmatism they bring to everything, but they exit. They are also, as managers and colleagues, unusually honest about what they can and cannot offer, unusually clear about what they need, unusually allergic to the performance of commitment, the team-building exercises, and the loyalty rhetoric, and the language of family that corporations use to extract more than they intend to give back. This generation has a very sensitive detector for that particular dynamic. They developed it young, right now, in their 40s and 50s. This generation carries a specific set of pressures that intersect in interesting ways with their relationship patterns. The parents who modeled marriage, however imperfectly, are aging. In some cases, the same parents whose divorce shaped this generation's understanding of commitment are now needing care, and this generation is providing it. And there is something quietly complicated about providing devoted care for a relationship structure you spent your adult life carefully not replicating. There is also the body. The awareness that the choices made in your 30s have different implications in your 50s. Not that singleness is a problem that needs solving. Many people in this group have built rich, sustaining, deeply connected lives that simply don't include marriage. But the body asks questions that the mind has carefully managed, and those questions arrive with more insistence as the decades accumulate. For some, there is a particular kind of reconsideration happening, not a capitulation to the family dinner question, something more honest than that. A genuine reassessment of what they actually want, separate from what they decided they wanted in response to what they watched. The question not of should I get married, but what do I actually need, and am I building toward it? This is a different question, and it deserves a different answer than the one this generation spent 30 years constructing. High-functioning depression, the kind that lives underneath a fully operational life, that doesn't prevent you from working or socializing or being, in most observable ways, completely fine, often has its roots in a gap between what someone actually needs and what they have told themselves they should need. For some people in this generation, the careful self-sufficiency that was so necessary for so long has become a wall between them and something they actually want. And naming that, honestly, without judgment, is the beginning of something. In their closest relationships, the long friendships, the chosen families, the partnerships that don't have legal names, this generation shows something worth honoring. A capacity for sustained, genuine, non-institutional love that is, in some ways, more rigorous than the institutional version, precisely because it has no legal architecture holding it together. Every year it continues is a year it was chosen. They are also, with their children, those who have them, often deliberate in ways that surprise people who expect the avoidance of marriage to correlate with avoidance of commitment generally. Many of them are extraordinarily committed parents. The commitment to the child is not institutional, it is simply real, in the way that things are real when you have stripped away the form and kept only the content. The contradiction that lives inside this group, and it is a real one, worth naming without resolving, is that the same people who avoided the institution of marriage because they saw what happened when love was obligated and maintained by form are also, in many cases, people who are deeply capable of the kind of love that marriage is supposed to house, The capacity is not absent. The container was rejected. And the question that midlife asks quietly is whether a new container, designed not by cultural expectation but by actual need, might be worth building. Some of them are building it quietly, without announcement, the way they do everything. What happens to this generation as they move deeper into midlife is worth watching because it doesn't follow the script that the people asking questions at family dinners expect. It is not, for the most part, a recognition that they were wrong. It is a revaluation of what they were right about and what, in their very understandable reaction to what they witnessed, they may have overcorrected on. The difference between protecting yourself from institutional obligation and protecting yourself from the full weight of being known by another person. Those are not the same thing. And at a certain point, the people in this generation who are paying attention start to be able to tell the difference. The turning inward that happens in midlife for this group is often a turning toward exactly that question, not toward marriage necessarily, toward honesty about what they actually want, toward the willingness to let themselves be known in the ways that the armour, for all its utility, has made difficult, toward the recognition that the self-sufficiency that kept them safe is not the same thing as the life they want to be living. This is not a sad story, it is actually a sophisticated one, the kind of story that requires a certain amount of living before it can be told accurately. They came of age watching love fail inside its most socially sanctioned container. They drew conclusions, reasonable, defensible, evidence-based conclusions about what that meant for them. They built lives of genuine independence and genuine connection and genuine meaning that did not require the form that failed their parents. And now, in the middle of their lives, some of them are asking whether the conclusions they drew were the whole truth or only part of it. Whether the institution was the problem, or whether what happened inside it was the problem, and whether, with enough self-knowledge and enough honesty and enough willingness to be vulnerable in ways they have spent decades learning not to be, something different might be possible. They are not afraid of love. They never were. They are afraid of what happens to love when it stops being chosen. When it becomes obligated, when the form outlasts the content and two people sit across a dinner table performing a version of a life that stopped resembling anyone's actual needs a long time ago. That fear is not irrational. It is, in fact, one of the more lucid things this generation ever learned to feel. The question midlife asks them quietly, without urgency, in the way the best questions arrive, is whether the protection they built in response to that fear is still serving them. Whether the wall between them and the full experience of being known by another person is still necessary, or whether it has become, like so much armour, heavier than the thing it was built to prevent. They will answer that question in their own time, on their own terms, without needing the approval of anyone asking questions at family dinners. That much at least has not changed. If any part of this names something you have been carrying without quite having the language for, I would genuinely like to know this. Not whether you regret your choices around marriage or partnership, but what you actually learned from watching what you watched about what love requires to survive. Not the institution, the thing inside it. That is a question worth sitting with, and I think the answers, if people are honest, will be worth reading. If this kind of examination, the real psychology underneath the choices that look simple from the outside is what you're looking for, then stay close to this channel. What we're building here is not a content library. It is a way of understanding yourself with more honesty and more compassion than most of us were ever taught was available. That kind of understanding changes things quietly in the ways that matter most. Thanks for watching.